interesting one. And I was made aware of this on Twitter through Dr. Tommy Curry. He posted this. This is another young scholar who's doing some work that I think is incredibly important. And in this clip, he's talking about Brazil. So this is it's a couple minutes, but I think it's important. I'm gonna share with you why. Okay. There's two videos that I'm putting together, and you'll see why when we're finished with them. This is the first one. So this is one that I ran across on Twitter through Dr. Curry. It's about some revealing new information. Here we go.
Country in the Western Hemisphere. And so outside of Nigeria, Brazil has the largest population of African descent today.
And the numbers are more than we have here.
Large, much larger. The numbers are much larger. It's close to half of the population. Brazil is also important because about 70% of the Africans taken to Brazil against their will were taken from Angola.
Oh, really?
And with my new project, I'm looking particularly at the men that were taken to Brazil, the men and boys, because they were 2/3. So the Atlantic slave trade, I view it as a large, really an act of black misandry or anti-black misandry, an attack on black men and boys who were the warriors defending their communities, who may have found themselves either defeated by Portuguese army or ensnared in the slave trade in some other type of way, or perhaps through civil war.
And when we talk about both Brazil and Angola, for those who aren't familiar with whose colonial territories those were, because they think of Spanish of all of the North and Southern Hemisphere, but we're talking about who?
The Portuguese.
That's right.
Portugal starts the Atlantic slave trade in really the early to mid 15th century. 1444 is the year often given, because after 1444 you have a steady flow of Africans. And they use a series of means and methods to establish the slave trade. With regard to what is today Angola, northern Angola particularly, and the Bakongo people, the Kingdom of Congo is one of the initial trading partners in West Central Africa. And
so you were drawn.
Okay, so I apologize for the way the clip ends. That's how it was on Twitter. I do have the whole interview. It is available on YouTube. And I'll go ahead and post that in the sources section after the show is over. And if I don't, remind me and I'll do it then. But this brother is doing some interesting work, right? And the reason I say it's interesting is because even though I got 3 degrees in Africana Studies, we've never discussed the gender dynamic of this various slave trades that went on in the Western Hemisphere. We didn't. In those classes, we never did. It was implied and assumed that this was a 50-50 endeavor in terms of men and women being taken and brought to the Western Hemisphere. That's how it was discussed, if it was discussed at all. If gender came up, for the most part, when you talked about slavery, gender only referred to women being sexually violated by white men. That was it. That was the only time gender was brought up. Black men were considered the floor, so to speak. They were not to be discussed. It was assumed that everything, about black men was known, so on and so forth. So this brother's doing research showing that in regard to the largest population, people of African descent outside the continent, in regard to the slave trade in South America, Brazil in particular, that 2/3 of that population were male. But that's not it. I'm going to go to some old school. This is an old school BGS clip. Now, he is not in it, but it is a clip of Dr. Claude Anderson. I played this clip several times on this show, but in case I have people who don't remember it, didn't see it, or are new, I want you to check out where North America was in regard to black men. And just like Dr. Matthew Petaway, I think his name is, explained it, we're starting to talk about enslavement as an anti-black misandrist enterprise, right? And I do believe he might be working with Dr. Curry, but nonetheless, let's check out this old school BGS clip.
Let me take about 3 or 4 minutes just to laugh to myself, because you just asked a critically important question, and your theme for today, fork in the road. You know what the great irony there is, Rose, is that's exactly, and I can spell the word exactly, A-X-A-C-T-L-Y, exactly for you. That's exactly where black folks were back over 200 some years ago. Because you see, the fork in the road, That was the biggest darn depot for black slaves in the country off of the eastern shore. See, when Virginia, South Carolina, and North Carolina went into the slave-producing industry after the Constitution outlawed slave importing after 1808 into this country, they had to have another way to create babies or get slaves. So they started bringing in black women into the country then in mass numbers. Then most blacks in the feminist movement don't even understand that. They think that slavery was about black women. It was not about black women. Slavery was about man to man, men to men. It was about blacks against white men and black men and white men against black men. That's what slavery is about. 80% of all the slaves coming to the country were basically black men until the Constitution in 1789 says you got 25 years to cut out and no more bringing in slaves. And the 3 states that pushed to get that 25-year postponement from 1789 up to 1808 was South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. They said, give us a chance to get situated because we need these black slaves. And why they need black slaves? Because they said, because the wealth of these states and the wealth of these colonies and the wealth of this nation is in black slaves. That is the primary generator of wealth. Black slaves are a form of currency. It's like money. That's who generated the wealth in the country. A black slave was like a walk-in express card, a Visa card. A white man who owned a slave did not have to work. He could earn money just by renting that slave out and going earning it.
Okay. All right. There's a little more to that. I'll leave the link in the section, the description box as well at the end of the show. But the 2 parts that I wanted to put together from those 2 presentations, Dr. Claude Anderson, Dr. Matthew Petaway, is basically whether you're talking about South America, Brazil in particular, or North America, when you really look at slavery as an anti-black misandrous institution, it goes right in line with one of the papers we read from Dr. Tommy Curry a couple of years ago on the show, where he talks about racism as a misandrous enterprise. Well, the most extreme demonstration of racism could be argued to be enslavement. Right? Western hemispheric enslavement. But when you talk about that, we're not supposed to talk about the gender dynamics. The only time we're allowed to talk about the gender dynamics is when it comes to highlighting black women's experiences with sexual violation. Now, we've covered on this channel for the last 6 odd years that black men actually experience sexual aggression from not only white men, but also white women. Right? This is very particular to the black male experience. White males obviously sexually violated young black men and grown black men. But when it comes to white women, they use the threat of mob violence. They use proxy violence, which is what we call it now. Right? They use proxy violence to justify sexually violating black men and boys, for that matter. So we were the only demographic that was violated by both. And yet, none of these gender dynamics come out in discussions, whether it's in class, whether it's in terms of reading assignments. Anyway, so I wanted to put those 2 clips together just to kind of highlight for you that as we talk about these things online, and even as black male studies begins to advance, we're starting to actually move the discussion in regard to black men beyond the comfortable tropes that we're introduced to, we're allowed to talk about, so on and so forth. We're seeing black men push the discussion in numerous areas, not just in terms of what people are comfortable with, as far as what satisfies their sensibilities, but also beyond that.